failed space vehicles, abandoned tunnels, and real estate developments left to rot. These are the biggest abandoned megaprojects in the U.S. From wasting $1 billion to tens of billions of taxpayer dollars, these megaprojects can be more accurately dubbed as mega disasters. Beginning with a failed hypersonic passenger plane promised to revolutionize space exploration. On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans tuned in live to see the Challenger space shuttle launched into Earth's orbit. Just 73 seconds later, disaster struck. Challenger broke apart, taking the lives of all crew members and landing a major blow to the U.S. space program. Not to be deterred in the face of tragedy, President Reagan announced the Orient Express space shuttle, an ambitious plan to build a hypersonic plane that could go 25 times the speed of sound. Equipped with the so-called scramjet engine, this space plane would escape Earth's gravity and circle the globe in less than 2 minutes. 4 different companies were awarded contracts worth $250 million to build a prototype. The plan was unprecedented, with no existing technology to build upon. However, there were more complications to come. What was initially thought to be an unmanned vehicle was changed to a passenger plane carrying a crew of 2 along with a small payload. This required much greater security features and advanced instruments for a vehicle that was 10 times larger than originally anticipated. As a result, the budget dedicated to it also shot up. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was no longer there, and America had slowly exited the space race. This meant budget cuts and the retirement of many Cold War-era space megaprojects. Reagan's spaceplane was one of the casualties, as technical challenges became insurmountable and the costs kept rising. The hypersonic plane, which had now become the National Aero-Space Plane Project, died in 1994, but not before costing the taxpayers $1.6 billion. Less than a decade later, America began to fund the country's first megatall skyscraper. Plans for the Chicago Spire were revealed in 2005 when Christopher T. Carley, CEO of Fordham development firm, hired famous Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava to design it. Rising at the bank of the Chicago River, the spire was a slender glass and steel tower with a proposed height of 610 meters, making it the tallest skyscraper in North America. The initial estimated cost of the project was close to $1 billion. However, Fordham Development failed to secure the necessary funds and sold the land to Garrett Kelleher of Shelbourne Development. Kelleher had a $1 billion portfolio and the U.S. property market in sight. He kept the Chicago Spire dream alive and gave Calatrava the go-ahead with financing from the Anglo-Irish Bank. Construction on the spire began in 2007, and the slender building's 76-foot deep foundations started taking shape. In the meantime, Kelleher went on a marketing drive across the world to sell the biggest real estate project in Chicago's history. There was huge interest in the building, and by mid-2008, almost 1/3 of the spire's planned residential units were pledged to interested parties. This included the building's $40 million penthouse and condos going for $1 million each. But just as the project was showing signs of becoming a massive success, the American economy was brought down by the 2008 financial crisis. Shelbourne Development and its major financial backer, the Anglo-Irish Bank, were struggling and pulled the plug on investment in Chicago Spire. With cash drying up, there was no further progress beyond the building's foundation. Construction came to a complete halt by the end of 2008. At the time of stopping, the building's foundations had left a giant crater where America's tallest building was supposed to be. Shelbourne and Kelleher were soon subjected to over $100 million of lawsuits, including one from chief architect Santiago Calatrava, who was owed $11 million. Shelbourne filed for bankruptcy in 2013, killing the Chicago Spire dream. For years, the construction site of one of the most ambitious megaprojects in American history was left with a gaping hole in the ground, reminding everyone of the colossal failure. That was until the construction site was taken over by development firm Related Midwest, and they hired Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the architecture firm that designed the One World Trade Center. However, this doesn't mean the Chicago Spire is coming back. Instead, it will be replaced by two new skyscrapers with more modest heights of 266 and 233 meters. The first goal for the new partners was to fill the hole left behind by the Chicago Spire, and they started doing that in 2021, using hundreds of tons of concrete and steel reinforcements. And 4 years later, the new construction has started taking shape and has even reached a third of the final expected height. While the Chicago Spire site did not go to complete waste, the same cannot be said about the San Francisco shipyard development, which was supposed to be the biggest redevelopment project in San Francisco's history. The former naval yard located at Hunters Point was once the site of the largest U.S. facility for nuclear research. This was the location from where components of the atomic bomb Little Boy were loaded onto a heavy cruiser in 1945. After the end of the Cold War, the shipyard was considered surplus to requirements, and the U.S. Navy decided to transform it into a residential development. The plan was to purge Hunters Point of its nuclear waste and build over 12,000 housing units, parks, and offices on it. In 2006, a company named Tetra Tech was awarded a cleanup contract worth $250 million. Tetra Tech cleared most of the land by 2012, at which point two different contractors started building homes on the clean land. However, while the construction continued, Tetra Tech found itself at the center of allegations related to cleanup fraud. Multiple whistleblowers who had previously worked with Tetra Tech came forward with evidence that the company had committed cleanup fraud. They had replaced hundreds of contaminated soil samples with clean ones to speed up the construction process. Tetra Tech blamed the fatal lapse on individual employees and agreed to a revised plan to get rid of the contamination. Construction continued, and by 2016, more than 200 homes had been transferred to residents who started to move in. But it wasn't long before the cleanup process came under further scrutiny. An independent review of Tetra Tech's data showed that the scale of fake testing was much greater than previously thought. In fact, almost half of the claimed cleanup work never happened. This proved to be the final straw for the ambitious development, which was immediately put on hold. More than $1 billion had already been spent on the project at this point, but the even bigger issue was the blatant disregard of public health. More than 300 units had already been transferred to buyers for $1 million each, despite a disastrous cleanup effort. It was later found that Tetra Tech wasn't the only one at fault. A 2018 review by the EPA found that the Navy had also understated the enormity of the contamination. Predictably enough, dozens of lawsuits followed. The homeowners collectively sued the developers, who then shifted blame to the U.S. Navy and even took the EPA to court, citing a lack of evidence. These lawsuits totaled up to $30 billion. However, in the last 5 years, only a few $1 million have been paid to the victims, with the prosecutors failing to settle on an acceptable number. Developers claim that the shipyard project can still become a reality as a new cleanup effort is underway. However, it may not be that straightforward because the contamination issue has become even bigger than in the past. That's according to a San Francisco grand jury finding of 2022 that labeled the previous cleanups useless. That's because the rising groundwater over the last decade has almost certainly given new life to previously dormant radioactive contaminants. This means that the whole thing might have to be built from scratch and may need tens of billions of dollars. Till then, the project's future remains up in smoke, and it is more than likely that the megaproject may soon be deemed unfeasible with billions going to waste. But these wasted billions still don't come close to an abandoned megaproject that was planned to stamp American authority in the field of science. In 2008, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, better known as CERN, commissioned something called the Large Hadron Collider, the most powerful particle accelerator in the world. The Large Hadron Collider has since helped scientists discover the Higgs particle almost 50 years after it was first proposed. This is a tremendous discovery because the Higgs particle, which the scientific community also refers to as the God particle, explains why certain particles have mass. Europe spent $5 billion on putting together the Large Hadron Collider, and it now lies in a 27-kilometer-long tunnel in Geneva. However, if America had had its way, the Higgs particle could have been discovered years earlier with the superconducting supercollider in Texas. Planned in the 1980s at the back end of the Cold War, this particle accelerator was 20 times as powerful as the Large Hadron Collider and had a 3 times greater circumference. President Ronald Reagan approved the superconducting supercollider in 1987 for a site in Waxahachie, Texas. Design calculations for the SSC had been going on since 1983, and it was supposed to start operating by 1992. Construction of a 54-mile circular tunnel system started in the town of Waxahachie, Texas. However, things did not go according to the script from that point on. The magnitude of the project made it impossible to stay within the allocated budget of $4.4 billion, which the critics had already deemed high. The project also did not get any favors in Congress from representatives of different states who wanted funds for their own constituencies. There was no support from the American scientific community either, as they thought that the funds would be better spent on basic research in other areas that were underfunded compared to high-energy physics. By 1992, the government had already spent $2 billion on the project, and the estimated costs had ballooned up to nearly $10 billion. NASA was also working on launching the International Space Station at the time, and needed as much funding as they could get. Another inquiry into the initiative also revealed misappropriation of funds and questionable spending on parties and dinners. A later review found that building the superconducting supercollider would now cost upwards of $11 billion. With billions in cost overruns and other massive megaprojects in the pipeline, Congress finally rejected funding for SSC in October 1993. A 15-mile tunnel had already been dug at this point, which was then filled with water to preserve it. The Large Hadron Collider, meanwhile, is now on its third 4-year mission, with European scientists confident of revealing more mysteries of the universe, as America wonders what might have been. The SSC was a massive waste, but not as massive as Nevada's disastrous plans for a nuclear waste facility. The Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository was planned to save Americans from arguably the deadliest threat to civilization. While we do hear a lot about the threat of climate change, nuclear waste is a topic that often goes unnoticed. America tried to change that in the 1980s. That was also a decade where nuclear paranoia was at its peak, and common life was often hampered by the threat of a nuclear exchange. In that backdrop, the scientific community started exploring a solution to dispose of nuclear waste safely underground. After studying multiple sites, the government chose Yucca Mountain as its designated waste disposal site in 1987. That's because Yucca Mountain is composed of a thick layer of volcanic ash, which would serve as a natural barrier preventing leakage or mixing of groundwater with nuclear waste. The site is also close to the US's most used nuclear testing site, but still isolated, with the nearest population center being more than 100 miles away. So the plans were set in motion to build a tunnel complex 300 meters under Yucca Mountain that would hold the nuclear waste from testing sites across the country. On paper, this looked like a brilliant idea. However, it was immediately met with strong opposition, particularly from the Nevada legislature. The residents feared stigmatization due to the risk of radioactive exposure and raised concerns about the impact on tourism. Further surveys of the Yucca Mountain also found some holes in the official narrative. One of the problems brought up was the wet tuff that could promote a swift erosion of the mountain, causing leakage. The residents were also concerned about the safety of transporting massive amounts of nuclear waste from thousands of miles away. It looked as if Nevada was chosen as a dumping site for America's deadly nuclear waste. In the aftermath of the project's approval in 2002, Nevadans popularized the term NIMBY, or Not in My Backyard, as a method of opposition which ultimately proved successful. After years of massive funding and massive opposition, the project was finally deemed unworkable in 2009 under President Barack Obama. All funding was immediately stopped, and the subsequent administrations have not found the political will or the money to resume it. After 4 decades of planning and $17 billion wasted, it seems like the Yucca Mountain Repository is shut down for good, making it the most expensive abandoned megaproject in the country's history. These abandoned megaprojects prove that vision alone cannot guarantee success. Completing multi-billion-dollar megaprojects requires crossing complex technical barriers, tackling economic and political shifts, and an insane power of will. But what do you think of America's biggest abandoned megaprojects? Comment your thoughts and keep following SIGNUM for the stories of the most insane megabuilds from around the world.